Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Thursday, April 30th. I guess that's our last day of April. Isn't that right? Does that make tomorrow May 1st? May Day. May Day, everybody. We are having a pandemic, and the president is crazy. Just so we let everybody know. Yeah, let's see. It's a Thursday. That means we can welcome Greg Dworkin back here for one more check-in with the doc before we take off for the weekend. The president kept me up at night, I guess. I felt a strange disturbance in the forest. Wasn't sleeping very well yesterday. How are you sleeping, by the way, during the pandemic? I hear a lot of people are having disrupted sleep patterns. Like I have said from the beginning, the stay-at-home orders are largely business as usual for me. The only difference is that I now have to do laundry and dishes for everybody else who's staying home. So, you know, it's not without its stresses, but it's not completely alien way of life to me. So it hasn't really disrupted my sleeps or my sleeping or dreams. People have said they've been having some strange or very vivid dreams. I haven't been, unfortunate enough to have that happen because there just hasn't been a big enough change for me. But something must have been disturbing everyone last night because the president stayed up late yelling about something. And I think we'll try and catch up with that story and what's going on. He is convinced that, I guess, developments in the long-running Michael Flynn case, Michael Flynn, notorious spy, of course, looking for a new trial after having pled guilty to lying to the FBI to cover up his involvement with the Russians and with the Turkish folks in the middle of the transition and while attempting, anyway, initially to serve as national security advisor, which is usually, for an advisor, that was awfully inadvisable, quite frankly. But I guess he's got in his head that he's been vindicated, et cetera, and also a new rash of stories that he was yelling and screaming about denying. We'll check in with those, I am sure. New York Times and others reporting that the president, I guess, has opened his ears to having briefings from his campaign team, and they have had to deliver the disappointing, I'm sure, to him, well, to them anyway, disappointing news that he's losing in almost all of the polls, as Greg has been telling us forever. And I guess he just doesn't want to believe it, doesn't believe it. I don't know. It's hard to tell how much he believes and how much he doesn't. And he had a big blow up with his campaign staff and even yelled at Brad Parscale and apparently, according to the stories, which he's denying, of course, threatened to sue him, which is, it's very easy to imagine Trump saying that, both because that's what Trump usually says about things, and it's something he says about everybody, and it's his most famous and most impotent threat. He very rarely follows up on any of that. And of course, true to form, there's really almost no grounds on which anybody could even imagine filing a suit, but go ahead. I mean, I think that would be fun. I don't know whether Brad Parscale is, capable of pulling the rug out from under him or retaliating against him if it were true. I'm not really sure. You would think so, ordinarily, if that's his campaign manager, but the guy may or may not know anything about doing anything. There may not be a real campaign or whatever it is he's doing in terms of running the media manipulation campaign over social media. Maybe that really is something and he doesn't want to lose. I don't know. Hard to tell. But just interesting watching the drama, I suppose, except for the fact that he's supposed to have his eye on the ball with respect to getting us out of this pandemic, and that apparently isn't happening. We've passed our 60,000 deaths. We did so yesterday morning. We're well past our 1 millionth officially confirmed by testing new case, and well on our way to, I think probably by the end of the week, we'll have 1.1 million. We'll have added 100,000 new cases on top of the million pretty quickly, and it's weird how that whole exponential growth thing goes. They continue to insist that there's a real and growing movement out there for reopening the economy, but we keep proving that there isn't one by reading the numbers on those things. But this is apparently a fascinating story to the media, and they're just determined to keep it up. I am wondering, I've been thinking lately a little bit about how the pandemic would have looked and whether there would have been the same kind of protest movement going on, or whether there would be one at all, or whether it would be a very different segment of society if we hadn't, so far we have yet to convince about, 10, 15% of active demonstrators that there was really something wrong with the shelter-in-place orders, the stay-at-home orders. And I guess there are certainly, now the worry among the media is that there are people who initially believed in it but are just getting tired of it and want an end to it. And it certainly is one thing to say, normal people would like to have, I'd like to see your plans for getting us out of it, versus that's it. There's no plan, but also we're not getting out of it, so I'm just going to go outside and do my own thing. I've been wondering what these protests might look like, though, if we hadn't been able to. I know we were all instructed to flatten the curve and keep our healthcare workers healthy enough to take care of us. Maybe we didn't talk enough about the efforts we made to keep our garbage collectors healthy and truck drivers and dockyard workers healthy so that we could get soap to wash our hands with, or our utility workers who keep the water flowing and the electricity on. In some cases, like at Greg's house, that means also keeping the water on. What if your appliances didn't work? What if you couldn't refrigerate food and freeze food and couldn't find soap and couldn't find running water to wash your hands? Well, that would be a big problem too. And we've been very lucky that the thing hasn't swept through the country faster than we could control it, because we stayed at home and washed our hands and began wearing masks, except for the president and vice president. All right, well, Greg is here. There's no point in delaying it. It's an inevitability. Let's talk to him. It's fun when we do. So let's start now. Good morning, Greg. How are you? Your mute is on, probably, because I took so long. There we are.
How about that?
Fine. That works now. Sorry about that. I know you pressed the button, but I made you press it by making you.
Well, I was trying to be polite,
Right. Well, is that something?
This is the part of the day that
I read a book on yesterday.
David, is like the first minute when he's talking.
I know.
After that, you're on.
He's not saying anything. I guess I'll keep going. Okay, you're on. I saw you sent me some more stuff about polling and things like that. It's been
we got all sorts of stuff. I want to finish up with stuff we were talking about yesterday because it wasn't at my fingertips. But I sent you two academic articles, and again, to point out that this is a common academic discussion, which sounds like it is like a political discussion, but it's not, because academics argue in good faith, unlike politics. Right. And so this argument about modeling of deaths has been going on forever. Now, this particular one, I actually went back and looked at the 2008, 2009 arguments that were happening between CDC modeling and the people who felt that it was overblown. So this has been going on for like decades.
Oh, sure.
But
well, okay.
This one is called Estimating Influenza Deaths in the United States. It's from 2009 in the American Journal of Public Health. And Joseph Brisi is one of the authors, and I know him from working with or around him in the past during the H1N1 situation. And what he writes here is Figure 2 illustrates why statistical modeling techniques are commonly accepted for estimating influenza-associated deaths. The dotted line in this figure represents a percentage of respiratory specimens submitted to WHO, and the solid line plots rates of death for which the underlying cause was attributed to pneumonia or influenza, that is to say, using their model. And peaks in influenza activity are clearly and consistently associated with peaks in rates of pneumonia and influenza deaths. In other words, when you go back and see how the model performs, you find that actual cases of flu peak at certain times. So you know that there's flu season, for example. And then when you go back and look at the model about deaths, well, they coincide with the peaks in flu season. So the model's picking up what's happening during flu season, and that's what they're using as validation. Then there's this later study, which happened to be done by Lone Simonson, who's the modeler that I often see, their chief modeler, currently at the George Washington University School of Public Health, at least for this 2013 piece, which writes, a research team consisting of more than 60 collaborators in 26 countries has estimated the global death toll from the 2009 H1N1 virus. and it's 10 times higher than the WHO's count. Because, and this gets to the point of what we were talking about yesterday, the WHO count is based on laboratory confirmed cases of flu.
Counting, that is.
The study suggests that the pandemic virus caused up to 203,000 respiratory deaths around the world and confirms that the H1N1 virus killed many more people globally than originally believed. That mortality burden of the pandemic fell most heavily on younger people and those living in certain parts of the Americas. Okay. And said reports of 18,000 laboratory confirmed deaths from 2009 flu from WHO is widely regarded as a low number because it's based only on people with confirmed cases. The study shows that the actual death toll was much higher than the official count because most infected people never got a test. So that talks about the stuff we were talking about yesterday, and that's why people model. So I just thought I would throw that in, not to bore people tremendously who were bored yesterday. But it's an important part of the discussion because then when you challenge the model, what you're really saying is, I don't know any more than you do, but I like my model better than your model, and here's why. And that's a totally appropriate academic fight to have.
Okay.
Which is not the same thing as you're stupid, I'm smart, or you're wrong, and the voters will show you. It's that here are the reasons, and then, show your work. And then they have a discussion, then it gets peer reviewed, and then, over time, people decide whether it was right or not. And of course, the hallmark of science is it reproducible?
Yeah.
So, then people go on from there.
All right.
So here's another different model that people use, not flu deaths, but rather polling to figure out, how Trump is doing.
Yes.
And today is Nick Gorovich's day 28 of the Navigator survey, tracking poll.
Okay.
Negative impressions of Trump's press conferences go up after bleach comments. And now we have this finally catching up in the polling. Remember, it happened a year and a half ago, but they're only able to measure it now. It actually happened last week, but
same thing.
Or this week or yesterday. But, time is compressed when you're, doing the home isolation thing.
Yes.
And today's Thursday, and it's 9:13 a.m., and who knew unless I looked. Negative impressions of Trump's press conferences go up after bleach comments. 56% have a negative view, including 85% of Democrats, 60% of independents, and an important, I added that, 21% of Republicans. Okay? Because you usually expect Republicans to 90% support Trump in anything he does, anything he says. I would contend that what he does is more important than what he says, but what he says in this particular case, because we're talking about press conferences, matter. Overall, Trump approval on the pandemic remains low, so no doubt the Trump temper tantrum about his poll numbers that were reported yesterday are true.
Yes, likely.
They have an all-time high/low, disapprove 54 and approve 43 in terms of handling the pandemic.
Yeah.
Then they lay out two cases against Trump for the current response and ask people what bothered them more. By a pretty clear margin, Trump's words and actions are putting people's health and lives at risk is more concerning than lack of leadership and plan. Just as an aside, there was a interesting approach that an Atlantic article took to the Georgia governor, Brian Kemp, opening up the Georgia economy prematurely, which the lead was something along the lines of Georgia practices, what were they saying?
I don't know.
Human sacrifice.
Oh, all right. That's one of
so
the
they wanted to make clear a
bad
point
things I can
as to
think of.
Brian Kemp experimenting with the Georgia public in regard to what they were doing.
Well, they're a willing public.
But concern about endangering the public does top having the lack of a plan. So if they ask the specific question, which of the following concerns you most about how Trump has handled the coronavirus crisis? Words and actions putting people's health and lives at risk. Overall, 46% are bothered, 64% of Democrats and 54% of independents. Or Trump is not leading the country and has no plan to get us out of the crisis. And that's a much smaller number. So this is one of those things where if all of a sudden he comes up with a magical vaccine tomorrow that fixes everything, people will be happy about that.
Yes.
And so, of course, that's what they announced, but that's not clear that's what's going to happen any more than reviewing particular medications that are being tried in various and sundry studies are going to be the magic bullet. Fauci and Trump had a press conference yesterday announcing remdesivir, one of the medications, which helps to stop viral replication, might work in certain clinical parameters. And Fauci said later that one of the reasons he was there talking about it is because he was afraid that the information may leak, so he wanted to get on top of it and announce it first. However, at the same time, same day, Lancet, a very well-respected, peer-reviewed medical journal, published data out of China saying it doesn't work so well.
Oh. Well, that's not so great. Although, I mean, we've been hearing the name of that occasionally. I mean, I think it came out in the
first. First it was hydrochloroquine, then it's going to be this, then it's going to be something else. And,
that's true.
People are still drinking Pine Sol in Georgia, so that's a problem. And people would love to have a simple, quick fix, but that's not going to be how it works.
No. Well, I didn't think so. But I did feel like we heard that drug name right alongside hydroxychloroquine early, and then Trump kind of
the difference
the
is hydroxychloroquine
is
a pill.
Horses.
And this is an IV therapy.
Okay.
So it's harder to do, has to be in hospital. It's only for the hospital ill. You can't overdose it at home. It's not available, that kind of thing.
Yes,
so it's safer in that regard. And at least, it's harder to hoard.
Yeah. Does it go in fish tanks at all? Probably not.
No.
That's a major vector.
Exactly. So in looking at various components of that argument, Trump's promotion of dangerous medical advice in the wake of his bleach comments is most concerning, though ignoring experts and pushing to open the country are at similar levels. Egging on protesters is further behind. So people aren't concerned that Trump eggs on the protesters, but they are concerned that he tells you to kill yourself by eating and drinking bleach. Now, this is interesting. He took a look, that is to say Nick and his group took a look at Trump's blame game on the pandemic. Yes, it's true that the public's willing to place blame on China, but ending your analysis there would be missing the whole story. Everybody except Republicans places blame on Trump too. And here on the next slide, we see that 58% of the public sees Trump's blame game as a deflection from his own missteps.
Well,
42% of his core base see him as trying to hold people responsible. Independents go 65-35 on this one. Point being, you can try and blame China. It's not working.
Okay. Well, he's going to continue to try. What else is he going to do?
Well, blame Biden.
Oh, well,
or if that doesn't work, blame Obama. And if that doesn't work, blame Hillary. And if that doesn't work, he's going to blame Brian Williams and Joe Scarborough, which is what he did this morning with tweets.
Yeah.
Going so far as to say that Brian Williams is a loser who got fired from the networks, and Joe Scarborough, look at what happened to his ex-girlfriend.
What?
What? Remember that?
I do, but wow, that's really something.
Scarborough had an intern sort of like die.
That's what he's talking about. That is amazing. I mean,
he went there. He actually went there.
That's pretty incredible. I mean, that was the thing for a while. It's been gone for quite a while as a rumor, even. But yeah, I mean, it was actually sure Trump is not coming on the MSNBC network anytime soon, obviously. But it was
no. But he's watching it and rage tweeting about it.
Yes. One time though, that was something mentioning that when back in the day when Joe Scarborough, and I guess he still got clout at MSNBC, that was something you would get banned from the network for mentioning.
No people where that happened.
Yeah, I can think of
although that's been undone, but still.
Yeah, right. Well, I think Joe lost clout a little bit, plus his focus shifted, and pandemics happened, and a disastrous presidency, etc.
Everybody else's focus shifted, so they started yelling at him about that.
All right. Well,
anyway,
really
Nick says, here's another way, the last slide in his deck here. Here's another way to look at the Trump-China blame game. It's a false choice for many people. A plurality of the public blames both. A group that includes lots of Democrats and independents. Only 36% blame China alone, and that would be the Trump base. So that gives you an idea what the Trump base actually is. It's about 36%. I think that's about right. That's why I keep saying that when he's at like 42%, he's still got another 4 or 5% that might peel off.
All right.
He's not going up. He's got a hard cap, and he's got a hard floor of 36. But I'm happy to see him at the low end of that rather than the high end.
Oh, yeah, right. The lowest we can get. And if, some parts of the 36% drink bleach, then...
Right. Now, here's just some more. This is much longer, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing. But this is a report out from David Lazer, Lazer.
Really?
A report is out with the 50-state survey of policy preferences and social distancing behaviors. Lots of interesting results from Northeastern and Harvard and Rutgers collaboration. First finding, there's a strong consensus across partisanship to not quickly reopen the economy. And immediately only 11% of Republicans and 7% overall say do that. So Georgia governor's on the wrong side of that. In the next 2 weeks, that's only 18%. After 2 to 4 weeks, 22. This is Republicans, but it's matching what the all figure is. In other words, everybody's agreed on this. Now, Democrats would like to wait about 8 weeks. After more than 8 weeks, 35%, Republicans 16. But the public overall, if you have to pick a date, next 2 weeks, 2 to 4, 4 to 6, 6 to 8, after more than 8. The biggest number from the public is 26%, driven by those Democrats. So the point there is it's not immediate. And the next slide, which is the only one I'm going to go on with the next 20 here, is what I thought was fascinating here. A strong bipartisan trust of experts, doctors, hospitals, scientists. The most trusted government entity is CDC.gov. Who's been missing? Nancy Messonnier, Ann Schuchat, and CDC.gov. They've been gone.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Redfield himself is the only one that shows up. He's a disaster. He should be resigning over the testing fiasco. And so should Azar. Of course, Trump is defending them both. States and local government are relatively trusted, and the tweet notwithstanding, social media rank notably near the bottom.
Yes.
People read Facebook, they don't trust Facebook. They do trust CDC.
Well, that's good. They're wrong. They're correct to not trust them because Facebook is often wrong. Okay.
Yeah. And people strongly support the social distancing measures that states have implemented. And you can actually look at it by state. So let's look up Georgia because that's in the news, and then maybe we'll do Connecticut as a comparison. So in Georgia, not taking the outbreak seriously enough, 27%. Connecticut is our control. That's only looks like 6%. All right. Reacting about right. In Georgia, they say 64%. In Connecticut, it's in the 80s. And overreacting in Georgia, only 9% say that, and 11% in Connecticut. Nobody thinks you're overreacting. People in Georgia are a little bit more willing to go back than people in Connecticut, but that's based on the governor and the messaging. But on the whole, nobody really thinks that the governors are overreacting. Is the point I'm trying to make.
Okay, I mean that's
where things stand with the public looking at politicians' response to all of this.
Okay. What are the numbers in Michigan? I'm a little curious. I keep seeing the complainers. It's about the same. Okay.
Well, I don't know. I'll look it up.
Op-ed complainers.
I do have, while I'm looking it up, I have this great piece from Susan Demis, our friends at Michigan Advance. Trump told us to drink bleach. Whitmer has tried to keep us safe. Whose side are you on?
I'm on the side of the bleach. I think bleach doesn't want to be consumed, and I just think it's unfair that we're doing this to them.
All right, so let's go see if I could find this and actually look up Michigan. And where did that go?
I just have the whole
Here we
graph.
go. Our report is out. Yeah, once you close things, it's sometimes hard to find. Here we go. Michigan.
All right.
Michigan is like Connecticut.
All right.
Okay, so 6 looks like these numbers are tiny.
Yeah, it's
6% looks like
are not taking it seriously enough, they say.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the numbers, for the most part, look more like Connecticut than they do look like Georgia.
Yeah, I mean, I got to get really in close.
Here's the big number that's different in Michigan. 24% say overreacting, which is one of the highest numbers in the country. The other one that's that high is Wisconsin. Those are the ones that have the two big movements. West Virginia, because it's West Virginia. So those three are the highest states that think that the government is overreacting.
Yeah, Michigan, I keep hearing from, like I said, from the op-ed complainers that their restrictions on store openings, etc., have been the tightest in the country, and the complaints I keep hearing are that they do weird things like close sections of a store, and you can't get in. Apparently a big deal to get in. I can't get into the garden section of my Walmart.
I got in, but I can't get out. I mean, that's a legitimate,
well, all right.
Complaint if that's what's going on. But I don't think that's what's going on.
Well,
they closed the garden supply part, so they were yelling about seeds. The thing is, being outside in distancing ways, isn't so bad. But
Right.
what happens is that people then overdo it. And that's what's happening in Southern California because they've opened up some beaches and then people go out there and crowd. And it's okay to be outside if you're not crowding. It's okay to play golf. I mean, the USGA
Beaches
actually has
outside.
their own recommendations about how to do that safely.
Yes.
But you can't congregate at the 19th hole and drink together afterwards.
Yeah, and people aren't particularly good at it. I understand. They start out in separate carts and then they all go to the tee box together and wait
Yeah,
around.
I mean, so that's exactly what you're not supposed to do.
Yeah.
So there's pluses minuses to all of that. But anyway, the
Yes.
point is that for the most part, the public kind of gets it. Then they get annoyed about specific individual things. But that doesn't necessarily change the whole scope of what's going on. And that's important in terms of whether or not people are willing to go back to work. I mean, there's 3.8 million jobless claims again this week and 30 million since the pandemic started. And that's like a big deal. And when the April numbers come out, because we're at the end of April now, they're not going to be pretty. And Trump is quite worried about that. And so that's why there's three stories. There's CNN's Trump erupts the campaign manager as re-election stress overflows. There's Trump presented with grim internal polling showing him losing to Biden in the Washington Post. And then the New York Times polls had Trump stewing and lashing out at his own campaign, which is the story you were telling about yelling at Brad Parscale and threatening to sue him.
Yeah, I like that one.
So that's in all of those stories. And the fact of the matter is he's really doing badly in the polls. And like you pointed out, we have been pointing this out to people.
Yeah.
It's not like he's the favorite. His
He's not
bounce is
listening to the
gone.
show.
He's really doing poorly.
Yeah, well, and I'm sure that there's been a lot of hesitancy to tell them that, and that they may have made their own beds in that if they haven't been telling them what the polls are.
Who are you going to listen to? The pollsters or Jared Kushner?
Yeah.
More on that after the break.
Yeah, right. Well, Jared Kushner's the one that's there at dinner every night, so I guess that. Well, that's our answer. All right, well, we'll be right back with more horrible things about Jared Kushner, I'm sure, after this. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, and I've learned that I either need to update these announcements more often or stop saying that the announcements are brand new. What's not new is that this message, too, is a call for your support in keeping the Kagro in the Morning show on the air. My thanks go out to all of you who do support the show through your donations. The stats say that Kagro in the Morning fans download our program about 2,000 times each weekday, but our donors make up only about 8% of our daily listeners. Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple to make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. If we're helping keep you sane during the Trump era, consider what that's worth. $1 a day? 50 cents? One thin dime? We do about 20 shows a month, so pick a number, do the math, and head to patreon.com/KagroX to let us know. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning show here on Networks Radio. And let's see, we've got more to cover. Interesting, I see a story I've missed entirely. Trending in Twitter, Cuban embassy. I'll have to click on that and find out what it is for later on. But Greg, I don't know if we've got that in your queue, but
No, that's a new one to me.
Cuban. It's Q conspiracy about the Cuban embassy, maybe. All right, I'll check on it later. Let's see, we just finished talking about some of the stranger restrictions that are in place in Michigan. I think there's probably room for them to loosen up a bit in some of these states.
Some of them are
without
arbitrary.
lifting.
You were pointing out during the break, and I know this because I have a kinder who's in San Francisco, in the Berkeley area. Breaking some restrictions on the Bay Area shelter-in-place rules will be lifted on Monday. Approved activities include all construction, plant nurseries, flea markets. See the plant nurseries thing, right?
Yeah,
So
that makes
this is gardening
garden
season,
centers.
and the gardeners are like a militant group. I have to tell you,
They want tomatoes.
they come after you with pitchforks. I mean, they have pitchforks,
Have them. Actual pitchforks, true.
actual pitchforks.
Can you get them to get out the
Flea
torch
markets.
people?
So they're going to open up the flea markets because flea market goers are also militants.
I guess.
And then car washes, sunbathing in parks, fishing, skateboard parks, and golf. Otherwise, shelter-in-place rules remain in effect through May.
All right.
Face covering rules continue. So you got to go wear a mask when you go out sunbathing. That'll make you look interesting.
Yeah, weird tan.
Yeah. But why flea markets? And
Yes,
as the
that one doesn't-
tweeter here, Heather Knight, San Francisco Chronicle columnist was saying as she's tweeting this, it must be really interesting going to the public health meetings and having all the public health people sit around the table with proper social distancing, of course, and saying, okay, what do we think about flea markets?
Yeah.
Do you think we should open up the flea markets?
No. I'm curious about that. I guess that's just must have a huge following in the Bay Area or maybe everywhere, and I don't know about it. But I mean, it's flea is in the name. Tells me, nah. I don't know why they call them flea markets. They really need to get rid of that. But it feels like that's where the disease would live, in a flea market.
This is a companion piece I thought I should add with this because it's going to be stop and go. It's going to be somewhat arbitrary. Loosen this one, but tighten that one. Go back to where you were if it's not working kind of stuff. This is from mynorthwest.com, and it's a profile interview with Jeff Dushin, who's the Seattle King County Public Health Director who did such a good job in the beginning. And he says the virus rebound is going to be 2 to 3 times as bad if Washington reopens too early. While some have argued that smaller counties with fewer cases should be reopened earlier than more populated areas, Dr. Dushin points out that there's little preventing cases from moving between areas, which is why they have to attack this regionally, by the way. For Dushin, that means a more uniform approach to reopening Washington that takes into account how the virus can spread county to county. That being so, the state has yet to reduce its daily case numbers to the point where reopening is even feasible. So Washington is doing well. They're not quite ready to open, but I think they in California will probably do something similar over a similar period of time, if not exact.
Okay.
We've been incredibly frustrated by the ongoing shortage of test kits. I don't believe we have the testing capacity we need equitably distributed through the community so all people who might want to get tests have access. Because of that, even the daily case numbers we've been seeing don't reflect the full extent of the outbreak. We know that from, dare I say it, modeling.
Yes, right.
When we look at the results of the tests that have been done, they don't necessarily reflect the prevalence of the disease in the community. They reflect the prevalence among those populations that have access to testing, which is an important point, and that's why black and brown people get hit harder but don't get tested as often, and so all of that has to be taken into account. Meanwhile, stable genius son-in-law, the Clown Prince Jared Kushner on Fox and Friends yesterday, we have achieved all the different milestones that are needed.
Right.
So the federal government rose to the challenge, and it's a great success story, and I think that's really what needs to be told. Or as Ian Basson puts it, Jared Kushner called 1 million infections, 60,000 dead, a shuttered economy, 25 million unemployed is now up to 30, and 3 to 6 point drop in GDP for now, with much larger likely to come. A great success story. If our leaders refuse to see where we're failing, they can't help us get better. And so Daily Beast carries that story. Jared Kushner calls coronavirus response a great success as death toll near 60,000, while Vanity Fair has a fascinating piece called Inside Donald Trump and Jared Kushner's 2 Months of Magical Thinking by Gabe Sherman. Obsessed with impeachment and their enemies and worried about the stock market, the president and his son-in-law scapegoated HHS Secretary Azar, treated the coronavirus as mostly a political problem as it moved through the country. Remember, Jared Kushner was appointed to behind-the-scenes run it, even though Mike Pence was the official face of the coronavirus task force. And Kushner was doing this by getting on Facebook and asking friends' parents who worked in emergency rooms what he should do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's better than saying, I don't know, I'll throw darts at a board and do that, I guess.
Much better.
Yeah. It's the right direction to go if you have to find some kind of an answer, but you should not be the person trying to find that answer if you don't have some to start with.
But it's interesting because the article essentially paints Jared Kushner as the second most powerful person in government who's basically responsible for everything that's going wrong.
Yeah. And fully indictable. Kind of
Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, shared Trump's view that the media and Democrats were hyping the crisis for political purposes, and for both of them, the biggest worry was how the response by the coronavirus might impact the health of the economy. According to sources, White House trade advisor Peter Navarro, fierce China hawk, and Deputy National Secretary Advisor Mark Pottinger, who's a name to follow, a former China-based Wall Street Journal reporter who'd covered the 2003 SARS pandemic, argued to officials in mid-January the White House needed to shut down incoming flights from China. Kushner pushed back. He kept saying the stock market would go down and Trump wouldn't get reelected.
Yeah.
That's the important thing.
Sounds like them.
It's one person coming in from China, and we have it under control, said Larry Kudlow.
Oh, Okay.
And then when the coronavirus exploded, Kushner was the second most powerful person in the West Wing, exerting influence over virtually every significant decision, from negotiating trade deals to 2020 campaign strategy to overseeing Trump's impeachment defense. Jared's running everything. He's the de facto president of the United States. A former White House official told me the previous chief of staff, Kelly, who had marginalized Kushner, was long gone. Mick Mulvaney, a virtual lame duck, let Kushner run free. Jared treats Mick like the help.
Well, I guess he can get away with it. Yeah.
And then goes on to say Kushner's princely arrogance has been a fixture in the West Wing since Trump inauguration. You know, according to a source, Kushner provided the White House 29-year-old personnel director, John McEntee, a list of names to be fired, and how Kushner, you know, is sometimes wrong but never in doubt, has an incredibly good opinion of himself, and so on and so forth. So fascinating stuff behind the scenes in terms of why has the pandemic response been so screwed up, because Jared's been running it. That's why.
Yeah, well, the Trump has trust in him for some unknown reason, you know, just a family thing. Although, you know, lots of people think their sons-in-law are bums. I don't know why he doesn't. But, yeah, maybe it has to do with the hype. But as de facto president, that was real interesting, too. Somebody, I think, noted that that's what ended up sinking Steve Bannon after a while, getting press as him being the guy who's actually running everything, eventually pissed off Trump, but the familial relationship will probably get in the way of that one. And also the fact that Trump, at this point in the presidency, doesn't want to really have anything to do with it anymore and would like to be done. And if he can watch TV and have Jared run things, that might be okay with him.
Right. So now, probably the single best article, if you want to figure out what's really going on with the pandemic, not so much the politics, but the actual science of the pandemic.
All right, some people like that.
Is in the Atlantic magazine, written by Ed Young, one of our absolutely finest science writers.
I did see
Ed and Helen Branswell are like, okay, they wrote it so you can trust it kind of people.
Okay, I did. Right. I started to read that one, and I pressed the wrong button, and midway through I lost it. But
well, I just gave it back to you. There it is. Okay. So why the coronavirus is so confusing. A guide to making sense of a problem that's now too big for any one person to fully comprehend.
Even Jared.
Even Ed.
Even Ed.
So,
right. Wow.
So he breaks it up into like 7 or 8 sections here.
That's how hard it is.
Talking about the virus, the disease, which is different than the virus, the research which is going on, talking about, for example, antibodies and how you make of them, how you deal with the experts. This is one of the more interesting ones. Last month, the legal scholar Richard Epstein, who, by the way, I think is contending for the Arthur Laffer of Pandemics Guy title.
Yeah, he did not do a good job.
Claimed that the current organized panic in the U.S. doesn't seem justified, and that as the pandemic continued, good news is more likely than bad. Jared Kushner, a type figure. His piece was widely circulated in conservative circles in the Trump administration. When asked about his lack of epidemiological training in an interview with the New Yorker's Isaac Chotiner, who's a fantastic interviewer, probably the best around, Epstein responded, "One of the things you get as a lawyer is the skill of cross-examination. I spent an enormous amount of time over my career teaching medical people about some of this stuff." Doctors and lawyers don't always get along.
No, that's a rare thing.
So here's what, we love lawyers that understand what we're doing, and we don't love lawyers who try to explain to us what we're doing. His essay initially speculated that 500 Americans would die from COVID-19. Don't let a lawyer take out your appendix. Do not let a doctor defend themselves.
500. Yeah. All right.
His essay initially speculated that 500 Americans would die. He later updated that to 5,000.
Oh, yes, I saw.
And said I was wrong. I was off.
Right. I think initially he said, "Oh, it was a typo. I meant 5,000."
Yeah, I meant 5,000. And that was a typo. I meant 50. And then it's going to be, I was a typo. I meant 500.
Yeah, easy enough.
So far, the death toll stands at 58,000 and rising at the time of this article. It's now over 60. Many other non-epidemiologists seem to have similarly accrued expertise in the field. I love the way Ed writes this. The military historian Victor Davis Hanson preferred the widely shared idea that the coronavirus has been spreading in California since last fall, a claim disproved by genetic studies showing the earliest U.S. case arrived in January. During a White House meeting, the economist Peter Navarro, I guess it's polite to call him an economist, Like you can call Larry Kudlow an economist, doesn't make them one.
Yes, they're
Reportedly pointed to a pile of hydroxychloroquine studies and said, that's science, not anecdote, to Anthony Fauci, who has worked in public health for 5 decades and directs the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease.
Now that's science.
Yeah. Again, you got to appreciate Ed's tongue-in-cheek writing here. The Silicon Valley technologist Aaron Ginn, Ginn, self-published an article on Medium called Evidence Over Hysteria, COVID-19, that was viewed millions of times before being debunked by Carl Bergstrom, who's an actual expert in this, and then taken down.
Oh.
Expertise is not just about knowledge, but also about the capacity to spot errors. Ginn couldn't see them in his own work. Bergstrom could. The rest of us are more likely to fall in the former group than the latter. We hunger for information, but lack the know-how to evaluate it or the sources that provide it. This is the epistemological crisis of the moment. There's a lot of expertise, but fewer tools than ever to distinguish it from everything else, said Zeynep Tufekci, a sociologist at the University of North Carolina and an Atlantic contributing writer. You will remember her. She wrote about why people should be wearing masks before the scientists did. Pure credentialism doesn't always work. People have self-published a lot of terrible pieces on Medium, but some of the best early ones explain stuff to lay people were from tech guys. Like the one that we were talking about the other day, where a tech guy was explaining about how mucociliary spread of virus happens and why it's more likely the larger particles than the smaller particles.
Okay.
Right? So there's a lot of interesting stuff out there. And Carl Bergstrom, an expert himself, agrees that experts shouldn't be dismissive gatekeepers. There's a lot of talent out there, and we need all hands on deck. For example, David Yu, a hockey analyst, created a tool that shows how predictions in the most influential COVID-19 model, that's the University of Washington one, that the U.S. has been using, is changing over time. So there's a website for that where you can not only see what the model is, but he's actually given you a way to look at, well, what did the model say 2 weeks ago or a month ago? So you can see how it's changed. And that itself is at least as helpful as just looking at the model itself. Well, according to this, only X number of people are going to be in the hospital. Yeah, well, a month ago it was like 5 times that.
Yeah.
Well, they were wrong. No, what we did helped.
Yeah. Well, that is interesting and a good point. Okay, so he's a hockey analyst, which is not to me, not a great use of your time. But
Nate Silver was a sports analyst
until
he set his sights on politics.
True.
So,
it's okay, and but you have to be willing to play by the same rules, and the experts knock each other's work down all the time. That's part of the game.
We were just talking about that yesterday in the beginning of today's show, and that's perfectly okay. Just show your work. So looking at that thing for like an hour, said Bergstrom, helped me see things I hadn't seen for 3 weeks. Because by looking to see how the tool changed, you get an idea of how good the tool is.
Yeah.
A lack of expertise becomes problematic when it's combined with extreme overconfidence. This is the part I love.
Elon Musk.
I start to talk with somebody on Twitter about, why everybody shouldn't be a home epidemiologist making their own models of what they think the case fatality rate is. And after 1 or 2 interactions, you get a real clear sense of the difference between here's why I'm saying what I'm saying, which happens on rare occasion, or obviously you don't know anything about epidemiological modeling, they'll say to me. It's, okay, fine.
Nobody does.
You're the expert because you've been doing it for 3 days, right?
Yeah, well, that's a very frequent internet phenomenon, of course.
It is, so
not just in medicine.
And a little humility is good for all of us, especially those who think they know what they're talking about when it's outside of their field. When scientists offer caveats instead of absolutes, that uncertainty we're trained to acknowledge makes it sound like nobody knows what's going on and creates opportunities for people who present as skeptics. And we were talking about that again yesterday and today. Science itself isn't free from the dynamic, though flawed mechanisms like the Nobel Prize, or Nobel Prize as we like to call it, the scientific world elevates individuals for work that usually is done by teams and perpetuates the myth of the lone genius.
Yes.
Okay. Watson and Crick, for example.
Right, true, yes.
Who might leave out the women on the team who actually had something to do with, the discoveries.
Right.
Through attention, the media reward voices that are outspoken but not necessarily correct. Those voices are disproportionately male.
True.
The idea that there are no experts is overly glib. The issue is that modern expertise tends to be deep but narrow. Even within epidemiology, somebody who studies infectious disease knows more about epidemics than somebody who studies nutrition. But pandemics demand both depth and breadth. To work out if widespread testing is crucial for controlling the pandemic, listen to public health experts. To work out if widespread testing is possible, listen to supply chain experts. To determine if antibody tests can tell people if they're immune, listen to immunologists. To determine if such testing is a good idea, listen to ethicists, anthropologists, and historians of science. Nobody knows it all, and those who claim to should not be trusted. In a pandemic, the strongest attractor of trust shouldn't be confidence, but the recognition of one's limits, the tendency to point at expertise beyond one's own, and the willingness to work as part of a whole. One signature a lot of these armchair epidemiologists have is a grand solution to everything, said Carl Bergstrom. Usually, we only see that coming from enormous research teams from the best schools or somebody's basement.
Two extremes. True.
Great article. It really puts in perspective what's going on here. And then the next topic he tackles is one that's dear to my heart called the messaging.
Okay.
Right? In the early months of the pandemic, while the coronavirus blazed through China, even veteran disease experts seems to misjudge the odds that the epidemic would become a full-blown pandemic. Fauci himself said the virus posed a very low risk to the U.S. on January 26th and was a concern for public health officials, but not the public at that time, which was true at that time. Many journalists offered similar reassurances and frequently compared the coronavirus threat to, are you ready? The greater danger of flu.
Hey.
We spent a whole show talking about that yesterday. Which flu? 1918 flu. Oh, my God. Some officials may have been motivated to avoid disproportionate panic of the kind that gripped the U.S. during the Ebola outbreak of 2014. The instinct to be calm and measured is laudable until it isn't. Alarmism is equated with misinformation, but when you do have something coming, nobody feels empowered to say this one isn't alarmism, Tufekci, the sociologist, said. There's a cultural script we play, and when the script changes, it takes time to shift to a new one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And again, I remember back in 2007, 2008, trying to work not only with CDC and HHS, but with DHS and the emergency managers.
Yeah.
At the time. And remember, the DHS culture is more like the military and football, and the HHS culture was more like public health and doctors. So just working out the interface between how you speak to each other, the language, the acronyms, the letters, the things you say, all had to be worked out in advance if you want to have a collaboration between the one side and the other side, the one group and the other group. And that's the cultural script that she's talking about. For example, it was a whole lot harder to convince emergency managers that bloggers had something to say than it was to convince the public health people. The public health people were easy to convince. All you had to do is tell them, look at the latest California wildfire and how everybody is trying to make sure each other is safe and where there's a good place to go. Look at wikis and blogs and how the information is real time. If you're missing somebody, call this number or come here to this place, which is safe at the moment, and at least collect your family and so on and so forth. And they immediately saw the value of that.
Okay.
Right? And you tell the same story to the emergency managers, and it's like, yeah, but it's not official. Why should we believe it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can understand the cultural difference there. And emergency managers tend to, I mean, they tend very often, although this was something we were discussing among the disease experts the other day too, having a plan and sticking to it, a communications plan, and the emergency managers one is a different book.
Right, it is.
Sometimes
so the narrative that experts underplayed the risk isn't fully correct, of course. On January 26, Ed Young writes, Thomas Inglesby of Johns Hopkins, and I've quoted him on the show multiple times because I met him back then, and we were talking about this back then, and I knew very well through interactions with him his views, which were informed ones, about the difficulty, for example, of closing schools.
Yes.
We should be planning for the possibility that the coronavirus cannot be contained, he said on January 26th.
It's not?
He had been sensitized to the idea that you really can have a really bad pandemic because he was there for the H1N1, and he saw that, and he was there for following bird flu, which didn't pan out as, thank goodness, a big pandemic.
Right.
Because that one has an 80% fatality rate. But he was familiar with the issues and so wasn't so quick to dismiss. He followed with a list of recommendations, several of which, more diagnostics, more protective equipment, transparent communication, the U.S. is still struggling to meet. Scott Gottlieb, who I don't know, I interact on Twitter, but I never met in person. He's younger. The former FDA commissioner, and Luciano Borio, who was part of the National Security Council's now-dissolved Pandemic Preparedness Office, similarly urged the government to act now to prevent an American epidemic. I hope the lesson people take from this is not experts were wrong, Tufekci says. If you followed the right people, they were overwhelmingly right. We just didn't put them in the right place so we could hear them. Mm-hmm. And that's what happens when you privilege people who stick to a line that you want to promote, Fox News, for example. Mm-hmm. Okay, and then he talks about World Health Organization and how they're under fire and how they've done things wrong. They shouldn't provide cover for leaders who fail to prepare the countries. But the agency's missteps do offer lessons for communicating in an emergency. In mid-January, it sent a now infamous tweet describing, quote, no clear evidence of human-to-human transmission of the novel coronavirus without clearly discussing other important details, such as a new case in Thailand and warnings in Taiwan and Hong Kong. They didn't give the world the tells, said Tufekci. And the same could be said of the White House. The fuller statement takes longer to explain, but that's how it is in outbreaks. There's a lot of uncertainty, and we shouldn't try to tidy it up. You have to tell people what you don't know. Cuomo's great at that.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Telling people
and Trump is terrible. In late February, Nancy Messonnier, the respiratory disease chief of the Centers for Disease Control, broke ranks and told Americans community spread of the virus within the U.S. was a question of when, not if. This was in late February. The experts were telling us. Messonnier urged the nation to prepare for possible school closures, loss of work, disruption to everyday life. Sound familiar?
Yes.
She started to tell us this in February.
Fired.
Well, sidelined.
Yeah.
And the idea that nobody knew or we couldn't have known, that's why every time Trump gets asked about, well, what'd you do in February, he gets real pissy about it and say, well, I closed China travel. Well, he didn't, but that didn't work in any case. And by the way, if that's the only thing you did and you keep talking about that, maybe
that is odd too.
That wasn't enough.
It doesn't, he doesn't seem to come up with anything else. And I guess maybe he does remember,
well, the next day,
the person who said the right thing.
Ed writes, the next day after Messonnier said that, Trump asserted the cases were going to be down to close to zero. Yeah. The day after, CDC Director Robert Redfield, who I think should resign, reiterated that the risk is low and said that Messonnier could have been more articulate. What he meant to say is she couldn't have been more articulate.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I don't know anybody who was thinking about, prepare for school closures in February. I mean, I know that
Redfield said the American public needs to go on with their normal lives, like the next day. So I thought Redfield should resign over the testing fiasco. In fact, this article points out he should resign over the messaging fiasco.
Yes, probably true. Okay, add that to the pile. But he's strangely not resigning.
Right. Now, Ed finishes this section. If officials and journalists are clear about uncertainties from the start, the public can better hang new information onto an existing framework. That's why we were talking about flu at all. Flu is at least something people know about. And don't undervalue the idea of comparing something completely, totally unknown and scary to something at least you know about.
Right.
So what you say is, look, it's an outbreak. It's a pandemic. It's going to spread through the community, just like flu. What's different is that it's likely to be worse or possibly worse. And what do I mean by that? Think about 1918 flu. That flu. That's what we're concerned about. Do I know it's going to be like that? Maybe it'll be just like 1968. Those flus were bad. They're not just seasonal flu. So there's a way to talk about this that uses flu that doesn't, hide what's going on here.
Yeah, people certainly could have understood. And Trump wasn't necessarily off base in saying it was like flu at the beginning when if it was about he was.
Don't forget, he said, "Who is it? We don't even know what it is. It's a virus. It's a bug. I don't know. Nobody knows what it is."
He was
we know
about
exactly
that,
what
clearly.
it is.
What I mean was the way giving people a framework. How are we going to deal with this thing? Deal with it like flu. Wash your hands, cover your face up, and stay away from people. That's the extent to which
the basic
it's like
underlying point there is Trump did not go out there to convey information.
No.
He went out there to be a cheerleader. He went out there to pretend it wasn't going to be bad, because if it was bad, that means it's bad for his reelection.
Also.
That is the underlying original sin that cannot be undone.
Yeah. Well, that was a huge mistake. And also, I mean, I guess he also imposed his own flu framework, as a lot of people have the same, or had anyway, the same flu framework, which is, yeah, I know that's what you're supposed to do when flu season comes around, but I never do it and I don't get the flu. So, and if that's the extent, if that's what you take away from comparing it to the flu, then you're not going to do well. If you take away, well, it's like the flu and what you're supposed to do, except this time you really need to do it because it's not flu, it's something worse. And if you don't wash your hands, and come on, how simple is washing your hands?
Right.
You're all going to be sick. Okay.
So Ed's next section.
That could have been all right. Yes.
Which I won't have time to do, but maybe you will.
Maybe.
The daily briefings from the White, it's on information. And he says the daily briefings from the White House have only exacerbated the confusion. Trump tried to downplay the pandemic, rewrite his role in mishandling it. His playbook is the usual one: deny responsibility, find a scapegoat, incite a culture war, and bend reality to his will by baldly stating his version of it, even when the version contradicts itself. The list of Trump's lies about the coronavirus is long and growing, as are the consequences. His promotion of hydroxychloroquine led to shortages, his false claim that anybody who wants a test can get one, sent droves of worried well to already stretched hospitals, and so on and so forth. He talks about the controversy about airing the White House briefings live. He says, well, it seems extreme, but it's an extreme time when a presidential briefing forces doctors to clarify that people shouldn't be consuming bleach.
Yep. Bad.
And talks about Jay Rosen's point about people think that more determined journalists can solve the problem, and they can't, and how Rosen argues the media's default rhythm of constant piecemeal updates is ill-suited to covering an event as large as the pandemic. So if the media won't change, the consumers may have to, Ed Young writes.
Okay.
Slow down, take a moment to vet new information before you share it. This is all good advice.
You're at home. You can do it.
Spend less time devouring every scrap of pandemic news and more time with local sources. It's the equivalent of hand washing for the infodemic.
Okay, yes.
And it might
local
dispel the
sources.
illusion that the pandemic can be tracked in real time, which is what a lot of the armchair epidemiologists try to do and tell you their numbers are better.
Okay. Well, I do look at the worldometer all the time, but
Yeah.
that's not because I understand what's going on. It's just, look at those numbers. Holy cow.
Yeah, look at those pretty graphs.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's the story. It's
All right.
Thursday, end of the week for me, and I'll be back on Monday if we're all still here.
I hope
And
so.
we'll see how Trump is doing in the polls.
Okay, he'll probably lose his mind, what's left of it, and we'll catch up with that. I can continue on with some of the story, too. You've done a great job summarizing it. Thanks very much. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Networks Radio. All right, let's see. I've still got I was tracking along as Greg was reading it and marveling at his ability to skim and take out the less than relevant stuff, to cram in as many sections as he could. So I guess he got us through. I'm going to keep going with this because it is a good article. He got through section 6 on the information, and there are 2 sections left. As he said, there were 8. The numbers comes up next, and I have not had a chance to run through this yet, so I can't parse out the good from bad. So I will waste all of your time, at least with the last 2 sections. The numbers come next. The rapid pace of new information creates the sense that we can actually monitor the pandemic as it happens. I've been a fan of watching the numbers as they change on the worldometers, and it's probably not the greatest thing for the overall narrative of the story. But daily numbers tell a distorted story. As April wears on, case counts suggest that the pandemic is plateauing in parts of the U.S. It does appear to do that, doesn't it? But it's hard to know for sure. That much I've been clear on. As my colleagues Robinson Meyer and Alexis Madrigal have reported, 20% of Americans who are tested for the coronavirus are still getting positive results. Good, I'm glad he's addressing this. We've talked about test positivity the other day when we read that very mysterious guy's story on the dark matter of the coronavirus, or COVID. I can't remember which one he used in the title. And that's where I learned about the test positivity rate, and that if you don't have the capacity to test everybody so that you can get a sense of what is the attack rate and what is the mortality rate, it does tell you something if, as they said, you just keep testing and testing and testing, dipping a bigger and bigger scoop into the barrel of, or the bucket of jelly beans, and you keep coming up consistently with a 20% positivity test rate. That tells you a good deal about how much more there is out there that you're not detecting. And only when that test positivity rate goes down do you get some statistical ability to be able to say, all right, I'm catching up with capturing as much of the true positivity rate out there as I can get with a representative sample. All right, well, anyway, as Robinson Meyer and Alexis Madrigal have reported, 20% of Americans who are tested for the coronavirus are still getting positive results. Worldometer will tell you that, too, if you just look at the number of tests administered and the number of cases we've got. A quick glance now tells you, as Trump was bragging yesterday, as we passed 5 million tests performed, we're now over 6 million tests performed, we passed 1 million cases. 5 million total tests, 20% of that, a million positives, a million cases. Yes, still 20%. It's up a little bit now, 6.1 million tests and 1.06 million total cases. So we might be dipping under the 20% finally, but just barely. All right, so where were we? This figure, the 20% test positivity figure, is higher than almost every other developed country and has held steady over time. It suggests that the U.S. is still mostly testing people who are very likely to be infected and is still missing the majority of cases. If so, cases could have leveled off because the U.S. has maxed out its ability to find infected people. Yes, we did talk about that in that context. This concern complicates the government's plan to start reopening the country after a downward trajectory of documented cases within a 14-day period. That would be the criteria they're working on there. If the case number, though, is illusory, this criterion is meaningless. I'd want to know that we're doing enough testing to be confident that those numbers really are stabilizing, says Dean, the University of Florida statistician, whose name came up earlier in the article, but I don't know if we read it out loud or not. But anyway, he says, I'm still not convinced we're in a good place. And I was going to say, in the list of experts part, I was going to say two things. One thing Greg reminded me of, after listing off all of the things that experts do in order to be experts, I realized Jared Kushner exhibits none of those traits. And two, as he was listing off, nobody knows everything. And if you want this, talk to these people, and you want that, talk to the others, and you want this, talk to the others. I was going to say the statisticians were missing from that list. If you want to be convinced that either you can find out more from the stats you have if you can't get a hold of the stats you need, or want to find some new metric that might be hidden in the traditional numbers. Traditionally, we look at this and that, but that's because traditionally we can administer enough tests to actually know what's going on. If you can't, how do you get to some understanding of the numbers you need? Well, I think that's where the statisticians come in with the test positivity rate. If you can't tell how many people really have it because you don't have enough tests, then tell me what your tests are telling you, and I'll tell you what you can extrapolate from that. So, well, now we're talking to statisticians. When looking at case counts, remember this. Those numbers do not show how many people have been infected on any given day. They reflect the number of tests that were done, which is still insufficient, the lag in reporting results from those tests, which can be long, and the proportion of tests that are incorrectly negative, which seems high. Likewise, daily death counts do not offer a real-time glimpse at the virus's toll. Because of delays in reporting, they tend to be lower on weekends. And then we were talking about that on Monday. And when we were watching Worldometer slow down over the weekend, you should never mistake that for, we're plateauing or things are coming down. It's just that numbers are slower on the weekends. And that runs into a Monday, typically speaking. Also, by the way, at the mention of false test results, incorrect negatives or false positives for that matter, we have the news from some bright spot from Korea, where we were hearing over the past couple of weeks that people who had tested positive for the coronavirus but had recovered from the illness were later testing positive again, as if there was no immunity offered by having fought off the virus with your own immune system and having recovered. And so that was very worrisome. And now it turns out that they are becoming convinced that those second positive test results that they got after recovery might have in fact been false positives, and that they are in fact negative for the virus again, as originally suspected they might be, and that's good news if it holds. And since we heard other news before, and it was bad news, and eventually some additional investigation made it go away. I hope that it stays that way through additional investigation. That I can share that article with you in the roundup as well, so you'll have it to evaluate for yourself. Okay, deaths. Back to the article. Deaths are hard to tally in general. We've been talking about that for 2 days now. And the process differs among diseases. The CDC estimates that flu kills 24 to 62,000 Americans every year, a number that seems superficially similar to the 58,000 COVID-19 deaths thus far. That comparison is misleading. COVID-19 deaths are counted based either on a positive diagnostic test for the coronavirus or on clinical judgment. Flu deaths are estimated through a model, we've heard about this, that looks at hospitalizations and death certificates and accounts for the possibility that many deaths are due to flu but aren't coded as such. If flu deaths were counted like COVID-19 deaths, the number would be substantially lower. This doesn't mean we're overestimating the flu. It means we are probably underestimating COVID-19. The means of gathering data always complicate the interpretation of those data. Consider the reports that the coronavirus can reactivate in recovered patients. How about that? Or that people can become reinfected. This really means that patients are testing positive for the virus after having tested negative. But that might have nothing to do with the virus and everything to do with the test. Diagnostic tests for COVID-19 produce a lot of false negatives, incorrectly telling 15 to 30% of infected people that they're in the clear. And even if these tests were better, the viral levels of a recovering patient would eventually fall below their threshold of accuracy. When such patients are sequentially tested, some will toggle between negative and positive results, creating the appearance of reinfection. False positives are a problem too. Many companies and countries have pinned their hopes on antibody tests, which purportedly show whether someone has been infected by the coronavirus. One such test claims to correctly identify people with those antibodies 93.8% of the time. And I guess if you test enough people, you'll get a lot of, fairly large number of people who get the wrong result. But by contrast, it identifies phantom antibodies in 4.4% of people who don't have them. You don't want to bet at all on that, I guess. That false positive rate sounds acceptably low, but it's not. Let's assume 5% of the U.S. has been infected so far. Among 1,000 people, the test would correctly identify antibodies in 47 of the 50 people who had them. But it would also wrongly spot antibodies in 42 of the 950 people without them. The number of true positives and false positives would be almost equal. In this scenario, if you were told you had coronavirus antibodies, your odds of actually having them would be a little better than a coin toss. And I guess that's why people are telling you to shy away from the idea of opening the economy with sort of like with immunity papers. If you test positive for the antibodies and you're healthy, can you be given a set of papers that allows you to head back to work safely? And the answer is not with these rates on the tests. No. None of this means that all bets are off and the pandemic is unquantifiable. The case count might be wrong, but it's almost certainly too low rather than too high, and it's more likely off by a factor of 10 than 100. The numbers still matter. They're just messy and hard to interpret, especially in the moment. On my phone, I can see weather patterns, the position of every plane in the sky, and the number of people currently reading this article all in real time. Hi, how are you? But I cannot get the same immediate information about the pandemic. The numbers I see say as much about the tools researchers are using as the quantities they are measuring. I think people underestimate how difficult it is to measure things, or anything, really. Dean says, for us who work in public health, measuring things is like 80% of the problem. If measuring the present is hard, predicting the future is even harder. The mathematical models that have guided the world's pandemic responses have often been portrayed as crystal balls. That is not their purpose. They instead describe a range of possibilities and help scientists and policymakers to simulate what might happen pending different courses of action. Models reveal many possible fates and allow us to choose one. And while distant projections are necessarily blurry, the path ahead is not unknowable. The long term is like modeling the trajectory of a falling leaf, but the short term is like modeling a falling bowling ball, says Dylan Morris, an infectious disease modeler at Princeton. Uncertainties about the year ahead shouldn't cloud how devastatingly and terrifyingly certain we can be about the immediate consequences if the pandemic isn't controlled, he adds. Finally, the narrative, our most favorite part. In the final second of December 31st, 1999, clocks ticked into a new millennium, and not much happened. I remember that. The infamous Y2K bug, a quirk of computer code that was predicted to cause global chaos, did very little. 20 years later, Y2K is almost synonymous with overreaction, a funny moment when humanity freaked out over nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was actually a serious problem which never fully materialized because a lot of people worked very hard to prevent it. There are two lessons one can learn from an averted disaster, Tufekci says. One is, that was exaggerated. The other is, that was close. You see? Okay. And by the way, there was a lot of prepper activity, by the way, going on with the Y2K bug. Oh, everything's going to collapse. All the supply chains are going to fall apart because of the Y2K bug. And a lot of people prepared. We did. We outfitted a sort of storage space in the house, which we called the Y2K bunker, which wasn't designed to actually shelter us in it, but not that kind of bunker. It was the utility room in the house with some shelving in it that had your standard disaster prep materials, water, food, batteries, etc., etc. And when Y2K didn't materialize, oh well, big waste of time, right? Well, now, shortly after that, oh hey, 9/11, and being here in the Washington, D.C. area, that actually meant like something might explode right here, right now. Well, it didn't materialize that way either. It wasn't that kind of an emergency. But again, I think at that point we realized, we don't live in California where they're prepping for earthquakes and wildfires all the time, but we do understand it is a best practice, generally speaking, to keep these materials on hand at all times. And so, to a lesser extent than when there was an immediate looming threat, we did maintain it, and sometimes better than others. When this pandemic round came by, we had I guess you could say we had the infrastructure to work with, and we knew what to buy, and we knew what to replenish, and we knew how to store it, and we were able to ramp up and get up to speed relatively quickly. And a lot of the materials that we have had that are non-perishable, that lingered over the years in preparation for various emergencies, including, various terrorist threats when the Iraq War was on, and stretching out over time through various disasters, including the election of Donald Trump. We had lots of stuff around. And we even have some, like I said, I think a couple of, a box or two of masks, even one or two N95 dust masks from when we were working on woodworking projects that happened to be around. And it was, masks. We'll store those along with the other ones. And we have some things on hand. All right, so where were we? There were two lessons to learn from an averted disaster. Right, one, that was exaggerated, and the other, that was close. Last month, a team at Imperial College London released a model that said the coronavirus pandemic could kill 2.2 million Americans if left unchecked. So it was checked. Governors and mayors closed businesses and schools, banned large gatherings, and issued stay-at-home orders. These social distancing measures were rolled out erratically and unevenly, but they seem to be working. The death toll is still climbing, but seems unlikely to hit the worst-case 2.2 million ceiling. That was close, right? That should be the answer. Or, as some pundits are already claiming, that was exaggerated. The coronavirus, of course, is not unlike, I was going to say it's not like the Y2K bug, but he says it's not unlike it. How so? A real but invisible risk. When a hurricane or an earthquake hits, the danger is evident. The risk self-explanatory, and the aftermath visible. It is obvious when to take shelter, sometimes, although really people could get better at doing so earlier. It's obvious when to take shelter and when it's safe to come out. But viruses lie below the threshold of the senses. That's a problem. They're microscopic. Neither peril nor safety is clear. Whenever I go outside for a brief masked walk, and that's an interesting thing, too. We don't do our walks around here masked, but I think population density is the big difference. I reel from cognitive dissonance as I wander a world that has been irrevocably altered, but that looks much the same. I can still read accounts of people less lucky, those who have lost and those who have been lost. But I cannot read about the losses that never occurred because they were averted. Prevention may be better than the cure, but it is also less visceral. Of course, the op-ed writers are out there saying that the prevention is worse than the cure, which is completely wrong. The coronavirus not only co-opts our cells, but exploits our cognitive biases. Humans construct stories to wrangle meaning from uncertainty and purpose from chaos. We crave simple narratives, but the pandemic offers none. The facile dichotomy between saving either lives or the economy belies the broad agreement between epidemiologists and economists that the U.S. shouldn't reopen prematurely. The lionization of healthcare workers and grocery store employees ignores the risks they are being asked to shoulder and the protective equipment they aren't being given. The rise of small anti-lockdown protests overlooks the fact that most Republicans and Democrats agree that social distancing should continue for as long as it's needed to curb the spread of coronavirus. And the desire to name an antagonist, be it the Chinese Communist Party or Donald Trump, disregards the many aspects of 21st century life that made the pandemic possible. Humanity's relentless expansion into wild spaces, soaring levels of air travel, chronic underfunding of public health, a just-in-time economy that runs on fragile supply chains, healthcare systems that yoke medical care to employment, social networks that rapidly spread misinformation, the devaluation of expertise, the marginalization of the elderly, and centuries of structural racism that impoverished the health of minorities and indigenous groups. It may be easier to believe that the coronavirus was deliberately unleashed than to accept the harsher truth that we built a world that was prone to it, but not ready for it. That, I think, is an excellent point as well, and also highlights one of the shortcomings in our own discussions of things, the impact on indigenous populations. The Navajo Nation ravaged, Indian reservations all over the country apparently ravaged by the coronavirus, and almost to zero notice outside of their immediate localities, unfortunately. In the classic hero's journey, just to finish up, the archetypal plot structure of myths and movies, the protagonist reluctantly departs from normal life, enters the unknown, endures successive trials, and eventually returns home, having been transformed. If such a character exists in the coronavirus story, it is not an individual but the entire modern world. The end of its journey and the nature of its final transformation will arise from our collective imagination and action. And they, like so much else about this moment, are still uncertain. And there, finally, we have arrived at the end of Ed Young's excellent piece. I'm glad we spent some extra time discussing those last two sections and getting ideas for further discussion. Yeah, that closing reminds me of a discussion I was having at home yesterday, and also of the discussion I see ongoing on Twitter, people baffled, apparently, by the continued rally in the stock market, which has come almost all the way back, and I'm sure that makes Donald Trump very happy. He probably thinks he did it personally. But yeah, people are confused. How could now 30 million people all of a sudden find themselves out of work and the stock market be rallying? Of course, I keep contending that the stock market really is the enemy of jobs. They hate jobs. They hate paying people to do those jobs anyway. And slashing payroll by any means is a good thing to do for investors. Leaves more money for them to extract from the business for themselves. However, you got to wonder about, well, what's the impact on the economy of 30 million people suddenly worrying that they don't have such a thing as disposable income? Won't that impact sales? And aren't sales an integral part of figuring out the value of corporations? And, they are, although I think that the thinking is that, there's just a lot of faith in the innovation of American business, because there's a lot of businesses. We keep saying that the economy's been shuttered or hobbled, and, big chunks of it certainly have, and there'll be a loss in GDP for sure, and people will feel it, no doubt about it, and even people who haven't lost their jobs are going to feel it as well. But at the same time, an awful lot of people are still working, and they're working relatively hard, not just in essential jobs, but still working from home and running companies that are scrambling, because they have to find new ways of delivering the products that they already make, come up with new products that people are going to want in the time of pandemic and afterwards, and when people are still worried about the transmission of germs and the virus and illness. And, a lot of people are putting their heads together about, how can we continue to do things that make money in this economy and in this situation after all. And, that's all it takes. The stock market rallies on the smallest things, and sometimes they really don't make sense. There's also that, certainly a big part of things. All right. Just wanted to sort of throw that one out there again and think that one through. All right, as we head towards our next break. Oh, I can tell you, I have seen, I'm a big collector of videos and explainers on things you can do to help yourself during the coronavirus pandemic, including simple masking. Every once in a while, I'll still run into people who say, I'm worried because more and more places are requiring face coverings, and I just don't have one. There are no masks to be had in the stores. And I guess at this point, we've all realized if we're waiting for finding boxes of disposable pre-made masks, we're probably going to be out of luck, at least for the next couple of months. And so people have sewn their own masks or bought handmade masks, et cetera, et cetera. And a few others are making their own. And I've seen a couple of relatively simple explainers on how to make masks. Lots of no-sew masks out there, including folding up. They say, take a bandana and fold it up, or a big scarf, and fold that up, and put the hair bands around the end, and then you've got a mask. And I realized, one thing I found out pretty quickly. First, I found that the webcams were gone from the stores. Then I learned very quickly thereafter that the bandanas and things that you could use to fold up into making no-sew masks were also gone from the stores. And so then there was one, make one out of a T-shirt, and I found that one. It was doable, but it was not all that easy to cut the T-shirts and have it come out right, and what kind of material to use. I made at least one out of a T-shirt. It was a, marginally usable thing. We managed to get a hold of the pre-made ones from the bedding company. Well, a new one is out there, and this one is the best one I've seen yet. And the explainer video is sped up a little bit, and it runs about 40 seconds. And I think that there's no audio to it really that's necessarily usable. There's a little barely audible commentary in Spanish about it. And one of the things that I kind of liked about this and the way it was being circulated when I found it on Twitter was the person the video is another one of those TikTok ones. And, it will identify the person here who made the video, Maris0614. I don't know if that's the woman who appears in the video, but it was being shared by someone else who said, my Hispanic people will never fail to amaze me with their creativity and resourcefulness. I thought it was a nice touch, and it really was good. And it's really the best, easiest one I've seen. If you've still had zero luck making your own masks, I think you can make this one. And I'll share it with you in the roundup. And you can even, it's made of socks. You get if you've got a nice heavy perhaps a woolen sock or something like that. The thick one would work best, but you should cut the top off the sock and then cut the toe off the sock and then cut the tube along one side and spread it out and then cut 2 slots in the side and use them as, that made stretchable ear straps. It was pretty cool and pretty innovative, I thought, and pretty simple to reproduce, easy to watch. And you didn't need any further instructions to that. You see it done once or twice, and you can give it a shot. So I'll share it with you, just in case you've been having zero luck. And you know what? It actually made good use. The heel curve of the sock fits under your chin, and it really fits comfortably and pretty tightly, too. There are some more advanced versions that you can put filters in, etc. You'll see it. You'll be able to do it. Good luck with it. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Or read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, that are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. And, let's see where to go next. I hope you'll, I feel like I want to share that video with you, like, right now. But, we can't do that over radio. But I wanted to assure you, if you really have had difficulty making these masks, I really think you're going to be able to make one decently with this one. And honestly, I experimented last night with just a regular old white cotton sock, which the material is probably not very good as a filter per se, but then again, remember, we're not trying to build N95 masks here. What we're looking for is something to keep to keep things in, not to keep things out. When you cough, breathe, sneeze, whatever it is you might do while you're out shopping, out taking a walk, if you're in a place that's congested enough to need that, that'll take care of you, I think. In fact, I did see something tweeted around yesterday that I thought was a pretty easy and fun explainer in terms of, if we're still not grasping the mask thing and why it's necessary, this might help you. There are still people who insist, they still misunderstand the purpose of masks, and I think the president is one of them, and that's bad news, because it's always bad when you have a stupid president. But they still don't understand that the masks aren't built to, prevent you from breathing in floating virus. They're really about preventing you from accidentally floating some virus to someone else who may or may not breathe it in. And, but even a simple mask can help you cut down the likelihood of accidentally breathing in, water droplets that contain the virus. But anyway, it put it pretty simply, I thought. And let's see, I'm not certain of the original source of this thing, but I happen to see it. Someone who follows and retweets Martina Navratilova. If you need a star connection here, she retweeted this piece from Trump Chats. This is from, or you'll find the person who gave this to Martina somehow, Trump Chatting on Twitter. But here is a brilliant analogy for how important masks are for everyone to use. And she shared it with a couple of people, including Martina directly. And that's how Martina got it and retweeted it. And here it is. Let's explain it for dummies. Or do face masks make sense? Let's explain it for dummies. I think everybody can get this one. If we all run around naked, let's say, and someone pees on you, well, for one thing, call the police. But if we're all running around naked and someone pees on you, you get wet right away. Right? Makes sense. The pee, it arcs, the trajectory, you get the whole thing. I don't have to do the math for you. You get wet right away. If you are wearing pants, some pee will get through, but not as much. So you're better protected. Right, but well, it's not an N95 pants. Well, don't worry about it because the next part is what explained it. But if the guy who pees is also wearing pants, the pee stays with him and you do not get wet. Is that clear enough? Yes, I think that's a good one. Well, what about it when it runs down his pants and it gets on the floor and it's a puddle and I'm naked but for pants and I step in? All right. You can get wet. It's true. But the point is, it makes it safer for everybody. Now, if we're all running around naked and then everybody has pants all of a sudden, then the premise is wrong. Don't hang up on that. Think about the pee. Focus on the pee, just as President Trump would be doing if he had a brain in his head. So I thought that, that explains it pretty well. I mean, really no mistaking what that's supposed to be about. So hopefully that'll change some minds as well. Let's see, a couple other roundup type stories, and then maybe we can dive into some of the longer stuff, some of which might be new, some of which I really would like to get to that Vanity Fair article and hear just how dumb the president is and also how devious Jared Kushner is. But I will update you on this. I did see yesterday the AP reporting that they now have 52 positive cases of COVID-19 tied to the Wisconsin election. I imagine that number will grow, and of course some of those 52 might infect some other people along the way. That's the way these things work. But just so you know, it was up. I think initially they said they had 7 cases, then it grew to 40. Now it's going to 50. I have no update. It makes me realize I don't have anything current, but maybe I'll go over to Google and check on the Theodore Roosevelt, because those numbers were still climbing too, which I kind of thought they might have reached their peak on that one. But what's the latest news? Do I see anything? Let's see. 15 hours ago, CNN reporting Navy launches broader investigation into virus-stricken aircraft carrier. That doesn't tell me much, but that seems to be the bulk of the latest news. More investigation underway, and okay. So they haven't reached any more conclusions, but I also don't see any numbers. Maybe some of these articles contain numbers about how many people have been stricken with the virus in the last couple of days. I don't think I'm just going to scan one of them and see if numbers jump out, but apparently not. So that maybe they've reached their final numbers on that at some point. That would be good news, but I'd like to watch out for that. Okay, yeah. Same news also about the number of other Navy ships that were currently dealing with coronavirus cases, but not much more. Okay, so just checking on that one. So Wisconsin cases up. We also, let's see. So, I wanted to mention this story. I happened to grab this from The Hill on Twitter because they're so adept at using social media and catching my eye with their pictures. CVS and Walgreens among the retail chains purportedly, I guess we should say, expanding free coronavirus testing. That stemmed from one of the recent press briefings that Trump did, and he brought in the CEOs. And once again, I think Hunter had noted on Twitter that this seems to be the same trick all over again. They brought them in a first couple of times and said we're going to have drive-through testing, and then that never materialized. Slowly, I guess that's actually becoming something more of a reality. But I know that at least like one of the companies that was brought in, and the White House said they're going to have drive-through testing. They were like, we never agreed to that, and they never set up anything. So anyway, this is from 2 days ago in The Hill. We'll see what they have to say here. CVS Health and Walgreens were among the retail chains announcing Monday that they will expand free coronavirus testing offered through their stores. CVS said that it will offer the self-swab tests. Those are the less painful-looking ones that use saliva rather than sticking that long swab all the way up into your brain cavity is what it looks like. It's really not, but I mean, I don't know if I shared video in the roundup the other day, but I tweeted it around. They took a video of what those original tests were like, and boy, do they look uncomfortable. Anyway, CVS will be using the self-swab tests. So individuals meeting CDC criteria can obtain these tests beginning in May, which is tomorrow. I don't know if they're going to be ready on the 1st or not. The drugstore chain has offered large-scale testing in 5 states since March. while the expanded self-swab testing will expand to as many as 1,000 locations, just over 10% of its stores by the end of May, USA Today reported. So there's another milestone for you to watch and see whether they achieve it or see whether Jared Kushner simply lies about it in the end. And so set a reminder. Somebody set their clock for the end of May, and we'll find out whether there are 1,000 locations offering self-swab tests to individuals, or whether they start complaining, we're out of swabs, or we never got the tests, or we never said we were going to do that, they're a bunch of liars. Or as Jared Kushner's new technique is, we did it. There are 1,000 locations, and they tested everybody who wanted one, and now everybody in America has been tested, and that's the end of the pandemic. Thank you. We're done. All right. Let's see. Ricky pointing out, I guess, one success with the pee story. And pee story is really, everyone loves a good pee story. She says that's the best explanation of the reason to wear a mask that I've ever heard. And I think that's basically it. I mean, they're essentially, diapers, right? If people run around, if they just take care of themselves, then everybody else will be covered up too. I got over my initial uncomfortable weirdness of wearing a mask when we were among the first people doing it here in our neighborhood for shopping trips. It was weird, and people looked at you funny. And there was a time right at the beginning. By the time we did it, we were mostly over this, but everybody thought that people who wore masks were people to be avoided. Those are the sick people. That's what they said initially. But when I began to think of it as I'm just trying to be polite to everybody else, then that made it easier for me. But if you need to think of it in terms of peeing on people, by all means, go ahead and do it. I think that does do the trick. All right, so I mentioned to you that Jared Kushner is just lying about everything, and we knew that to be the case. But some of these stories over the last couple of days have made this clearer, I think, easier to understand. Before I forget to add this one, just because it's Thursday, if you were expecting the House to return to Washington and actually oversee the massive giveaways to corporations and fakers of all sorts, and do some oversight over the president's response to coronavirus, if you're expecting them to come back on May 4th as originally scheduled, the answer is no. The House has reversed course. They won't return next week, but they really need to, as Joan says, figure out a way to maybe do their job at some point. We didn't hear from Joan on Tuesday because she was busy with all of this stuff, and I thought I might at least fill you in on that one. She's got a piece. House reverses course, won't return next week. It's time they figure out a plan for doing their job. Really would like to work out the particulars of why they still think. I've heard that Nancy Pelosi has has been briefed on some serious problems and possibly constitutional objections to remote voting, and I could guess at what some of them might be, but I would love to hear them explained and address some of them and see if we can't work out a solution. I know they're probably working on that, but we're getting a little bit impatient about that, and I think rightly so, with so much going on and so little oversight of it, and so many additional bad stories about what's happening. Not to mention the fact that with 30 million people out of work, at some point it might be a nice idea if they actually came back. And now I'm glad that they're saying, universal basic income is something we have to be open to. Well, come on back and maybe do that thing. Or work something out and then do it by unanimous consent if you can. And I don't know. But at some point, I know it's dangerous and all, but we're going to have to get people a way of doing it, of taking care of business that's less dangerous if that's necessary. I mean, I don't know. It's not stopping the president. He's, of course, corralling all the West Point cadets back into West Point so that he can give them a graduation speech and use it to yell at various anchors on television or something like that. We've mentioned that. But, they're clearly trying to go about their business. We can probably find a better and safer way of going about finding a way to save the rest of us. It is about time. You can read Joan's article outlining all of that and getting down to the brass tacks of, well, when will they come back and what's their thinking now? as I mentioned, let me run back up towards the top of Pocket and get to some of these other stories that I wanted to share with you. Let's see. For one thing, what sorts of things might we say be conducting oversight of? And also, how devious is Jared Kushner? I didn't put this story aside about Kushner, but Greg mentioned, his just sort of happy facing the whole pandemic and saying, well, we've met our milestones. Wasn't that it? Let me see. I think his story is, right here. Jared Kushner calls coronavirus response what did he say? A great success story as death toll nears 60,000, according to the Daily Beast, which then stamps it with an what? And I think all he's doing here is essentially, I think this is what is going to eventually come out of this. He didn't spit it out explicitly yesterday, but I have a feeling, and this may work with stupid people in particular. You say, as we've been pointing out, you said we were going to get to 60,000 deaths at August, when this was more or less over. That was going to signal we'd been over the hump and we were on the backside of the downslope of the curve and almost done with things and maybe ready to open up. Et cetera, et cetera. And then we hit the 60,000 in April, and that's a bad thing, not a huge victory. But I think Kushner is aiming towards saying, well, we've achieved the milestone, 60,000. As we told you, 60,000 would be the number of deaths we would reach when this pandemic was over. And as you know, people are now talking about reopening the economy. So, as you see, we hit the mark. Exactly. The 60,000 deaths, ready to open. Pandemic over. Anybody who dies now has died of something else. But 60,000 was what we told you was going to happen for the pandemic. 60,000 is here, and the pandemic is clearly over when the stores are open and everybody goes back out shopping and goes back to work again. And that's happening, even though we're not ready to do that, and it will mean more people die. But when they die, it will be from some other thing. We don't know what we'll call it yet. But I think that might be what they're actually aiming at. And I guess we found out from polling that there's about 36% of the public for whom that will actually work, which is a little bit disappointing, but kind of always has been. What other things might the Congress want to come back and address in addition to actually helping people survive or considering whether UBI is something they want to do? Oversight. And how bad is it getting out there with the contracting? How close to war dogs have we actually gotten? And by the way, if you still haven't seen War Dogs, but you've heard me refer to Project Airbridge as War Dogs for PPE, here's a story of War Dogs for ventilators happening out there. And if you still don't know what I mean, War Dogs is on HBO this month. If you happen to be a subscriber or have access to any of their streaming services, great. You're very welcome to take a look at it. You're very privileged, and that's nice, and we acknowledge it. And a lot of you probably have it. Take a look. It's entertaining. If you like Jonah Hill, you'll enjoy this too. He's one of the main characters, and they'll explain just how crazy government contracting can get. Here's another one. After one tweet to President Trump, this man got $69 million from New York for ventilators. And then I'll read you the subheader, and then there's a story that follows afterwards. It has more details, but I guess you'll get the flavor of it when I tell you the Silicon Valley engineer, who had no background in medical supplies but was recommended by the White House, never delivered the ventilators. Well, I guess that's good for a sad trombone, right? Rosalind Adams and Ken Bensinger report this for BuzzFeed News. An extraordinary story, but probably just one of many. On March 27th, as emergency rooms in New York and across the country began filling with coronavirus patients struggling to breathe, President Donald Trump posted on Twitter to urge Ford and General Motors to, all caps, start making ventilators now. Now, pausing for just a second to discuss that, kind of tweet out of the blue, it just reminded me that at some point he finally did say, well, I might invoke the Defense Production Act to force them to do it. And I don't think he actually ended up doing that with the car makers, but there was some inkling that there might be compliance. The car makers, for some reason, looked like a likely source of building such things, although I don't know whether it was really any more realistic than anybody else being asked to do it. But initially there was some idea about compliance, and I wondered how far they got on all of that. Now that Trump, well, later, of course, we found out that New York didn't need quite as many ventilators as they thought they might because they lucked out and managed to cap the spread of the virus enough that they didn't actually completely overwhelm the local hospitals and their ventilator capacity versus what they were able to get their hands on from elsewhere. But even so, even had Ford and General Motors jumped immediately on it, there was no indication that they would have been able to deliver ventilators until at least about now, if not later, the bulk of them. So it's a good thing that New York managed to slip under the wire with what they were able to acquire before the whole thing collapsed. But that was never a short-term solution. But I wondered whether Ford and General Motors had jumped in and actually like retooled a line somewhere to try and build ventilators, only to find out that Trump's anger tweeting / DPA invocation had left them with a line now equipped to build ventilators that they weren't quite sure what they were going to do with. But really, you ought to build them anyway, put them in a strategic reserve, send them to rural hospitals where they have one or two, because they're going to get the next round of things. Anyhow, so he tweets, start making ventilators now, right? So what happens? One of the thousands of replies that the tweet attracted struck an equally urgent tone, and it said, we can supply ICU ventilators, invasive and non-invasive. Have someone call me urgent, in all caps, urgent. Well, have someone call me. Imagine tweeting that to Donald Trump. Have someone call me, urgent. Somehow, this gets through. Its author was Oren Pines, an electrical engineer in Silicon Valley. And I think the name jumps out and appears to be Israeli in origin. And I think that's actually the case. We find out later in the story. Yaron, Y-A-R-O-N, Oren Pines, O-R-E-N-Pines, Pines. An electrical engineer in Silicon Valley. And I would think electrical engineers should be able to build the guts and the driver of a ventilator, right? So, what's up with this guy? Well, he's a specialist in mobile phone technology. He currently has just 75 followers on Twitter and no apparent experience in government contracting or medical devices. That's what makes things a little weird and suspicious. And 75 followers, okay, but that's not the sort of person that you would think could tweet at the president, call me, urgent, and then he'd get a call. But 3 days later, New York State paid Oren Pines $69.1 million. 69.1, nice, $0.1 million. The payment was for 1,450 ventilators. And if you're doing the math in your head, don't bother. It's an astonishing $47,656 per ventilator, at least triple the standard retail price of high-end models. Not a single ventilator, though, ever arrived. How could that happen? That's a good question. A state official, speaking on background because he was not authorized to publicly discuss the terms of the deal, said New York entered into the contract with Oren Pines at the direct recommendation of the White House Coronavirus Task Force. Jared Kushner. How could Jared Kushner know an Israeli-American Silicon Valley engineer who would be brazen enough to say, I don't know anything about medicine, I don't know anything about ventilators, I don't know anything about government contracting, I don't know where I'm going to get this stuff, but call me urgent. And yes, you absolutely should. I would recommend to you, yes, send me $69.1 million, and then I'll see what I can do about getting these things. So you know where that actually came from. And I was very interested in this story, and I was hoping to unravel. There's some details in here that begins to make a certain amount of sense. Like you say, well, why doesn't New York go and beat the crap out of that guy and take its money back? Well, it's not going to beat the crap out of the guy route, but it is seeking to do that. But I thought this might unravel a little bit like the other ventilator one where the story was about a long-term contract for ventilators, and they have until X date to fulfill the contract, and so there might still be room for them to be able to do so. But this one never quite unpacks the same way. Nearly a month later, New York has terminated the contract, and the state is now trying to recover all the money it paid the Silicon Valley electrical engineer, which is a surprise in itself because ordinarily government contracting, when the ventilators get here, we'll pay you, but not now, not in the panic, which is why we need oversight for these things. Officials refused to say how much the state had been able to claw back. We are in discussions on a few remaining issues, said Heather Grohl, a spokesperson for the New York Office of General Services, part of the interagency effort to help New York get supplies. But again, the way the world really works versus the way you think it ought to or you wish it would, or really honestly the way Donald Trump would think things would work, is you give $69.1 million to this guy. He supplies no ventilators, and it doesn't look like he's ever going to be able to. You cancel the contract, and then you say, the part where it diverges is where, we're in discussions on a few remaining issues. How about we arrest the guy and whack him until you get money? But maybe he doesn't have. I don't know. He's in California. California's not unfriendly territory. Can't there be an interstate pact where New York says, hey, California, grab this guy and either beat the crap out of him or extradite him here to New York so we can beat the crap out of him? And as a matter of fact, it's probably best if you beat the crap out of him and don't put him on a plane. Although, hell, who deserves coronavirus more than this guy? You would think, right? Still, how do you do this? Reached by telephone, Orrin Pine said he basically said no comment, right? The money he received on March 30th was the largest single payment made by the New York Department of Health under an executive order issued by Cuomo last month that aimed to streamline procurement so that critical medical equipment could reach hospitals as quickly as possible. You understand. The episode underscores the extent to which the fear of overrun hospitals prompted politicians around the country, in New York in particular, to turn to untested and at times unqualified vendors. We had no choice but to overturn every rock to find ventilators and other needed equipment, said Rich Azzopardi, the senior advisor to Cuomo, referring to the state's scramble to find critical equipment as the pandemic overtook New York. States were forced to fend for themselves. Why? Because the president made them. To purchase life-saving supplies to combat a global pandemic, and with all modeling showing a more severe spread of this virus with more hospitalizations and more fatalities, he said. He added that the state has been able to meet most of its needs and is now reevaluating some contracts and canceling others, while going through with other contracts as it tries to build up stockpiles and prepare New York for any future emergencies. Like most states, New York's procurement rules typically prohibit payments for goods or services until an order has been fulfilled. But Cuomo suspended those rules last month to meet the urgent need for ventilators, masks, gowns, etc. A 25-member team now works overtime to vet potential vendors. Not this one. In some cases, it has begun paying for orders before they're fulfilled. Between March 19th and April 27th, the health department cut 77 checks for $1 million or more for medical supplies for a total of nearly $735 million. Some of the recipients are established healthcare suppliers. There are some listed here, and they have a long history of trading with New York State, but the overwhelming majority of the payments were made to an eclectic mix of firms with little or no apparent experience in medicine. Upscale fashion and other apparel brands. I don't know what they were making. Masks? I don't know. They identify the brand, but they don't say what the deal was. Chinese iron ore and tool importers. A company that sells hair and wrinkle removal products. A number of private equity and investment firms. And even the Qatar Fund for Development, the state-run foreign aid arm of the petroleum-rich Persian Gulf nation. Other states and government agencies also scrambled to strike deals for needed supplies. The California Department of Transportation agreed to pay $12.74 apiece for N95 masks that usually sell for $1.25. FEMA signed a purchase order for 2 million respirator masks at $7.25 apiece, 10 times the price it's paying to buy them directly from 3M, only to cancel after the vendor said it couldn't deliver. So it's happening everywhere. New York City, meanwhile, rushed over the past month to order 214.7 million pieces of PPE, including N95 masks, gloves, face shields, etc. So far, only 8%, just 17 million of those items has actually arrived. But it was the state government in Albany that proved most aggressive in its acquisitions as it struggled to deal with COVID-19. There was the Cuomo urgency for 30,000 ventilators, etc., right? 3 days later, the state issued a second of two payments totaling almost $116 million to a small Brooklyn company called Dome International that rents ventilators and other respiratory devices to hospitals and nursing homes. The company has no website, no record of prior contracting with New York or with the federal government. The deal was for 5,700 ventilators, and calls to Dome International's co-owner, David Chait, not returned. Well, it's just one of several, but I guess the most egregious of them being this Silicon Valley engineer with no experience in anything, but who got recommended essentially to New York directly from the White House. And guess what? When it all fell apart, the White House said, "Oh, we don't know this guy. We don't know how it happened." He tweeted to the president. He got $69 million, and he gave nobody anything. Well, now you know what to do if you're out of money.
From Daily Kos Radio on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Lots more to get to, of course, but now it's time for Justice Putnam to take a shot at getting into all those things. He'll be updating you on what's happening in the federal prison system with coronavirus, a real disaster there. And a look internationally. Let's see. Bosnia reported its sharpest daily rise in new coronavirus infections this month after easing lockdown.